We begin with a short prayer. Father, we ask your blessing and your care on the people who are working to find cures and antidotes for the pandemic, and your consolation for people who have lost family and friends in this pandemic. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord. Okay, we've been kind of looking at the church in the United States at this time, so I'm going to continue on a little of this. What we're doing right now is going through a view of the church, in the 1800s, just before the 1900s. We're sort of looking at what it is internationally. So during the 1800s, the Catholic Church in the United States established a network of dioceses, seminaries, parishes, and schools. The most important thing to notice in that list is seminaries, because once you have seminaries, you have native clergy. And when you watch historically, when the church comes into an area, they come in as a missionary thing normally, and when they are a missionary thing, they're seen as foreign by many of the people. However, in the next stage, when they establish seminaries and the native peoples began to study and become priests, you find that the church takes on a character that separates it from any other national thing in the world. So if you go through Poland, you'll find that there's very things are just a part of the Polish church that never occurred to us. And they see things in our church that are very different. I'll give you an example. I was in Poland for the Feast of Corpus Christi one year. And on the Feast of Corpus Christi, all churches have First Communions. So all the Catholics in Poland made their First Communion. The following Sundays, I was there over a month. The following Sundays, if you made First Communion, suppose in the mission, then the next Sunday you would go to Nativity Parish, you'd wear your First Communion outfit so that everyone knew in the church you had made First Communion last week. The pastor would introduce you, and there'd be a lot of kids from different parishes there. The following week you did it again. It went on for a month, that you'd wear your little outfit in a different church each time and be introduced. And, they made a big deal of that. Well, that's peculiar to the church in Poland. And you would find churches take on peculiarities. Not that they have anything to do with doctrine or anything. It's the same church, same services and everything. But it takes on its own identity, and then it really begins to grow. So we had the seminaries. And the other thing is schools. The real problem was to provide priests and peacefully gathering so many immigrants from so many lands, languages, and customs into the American church. The American church, the Catholic Church in the United States, was a better representation of what America was to be than America was at the time. Because most Protestants were from countries and stuff, not Catholics. And if you're familiar with the East Coast, I found it hysterical, although I'm sure it was very difficult for people for many times. You can go into several cities, into really old sections of the cities, and on four corners at a intersection, there will be four Catholic churches: Irish Catholic, French Catholic, German Catholic, Italian Catholic. And so it was very, very difficult to get people together, largely because the French Catholics were served by French missionaries, German Catholics by German missionaries. As they came to be served by Americans, then they assimilated and came to what we would call. Some people in the United States regarded the influx of Catholics as an attempt to establish a foreign religion in the country and perhaps to create a new papal state. Okay? So they saw the influx of Catholics as dangerous to what they considered the Protestant ethic or the Protestant founding of the faith. United States. And while the United States was largely founded by Protestants, you have to know that the United States was founded as a deist society, not as a Protestant, or much less a Catholic or anything. It was deist. Our documents recognize God. Our documents don't recognize any religion. So it was a very interesting thing. The Catholic Church, again, was the best example of what America was going to become. The nativists wanted to keep the country for the native born. Incidentally, by the native born, they didn't mean the Indians. They meant Protestants who'd come in and been born here. They spread false rumors about Catholics and so inflamed one community that an Ursuline convent was burned to the ground near Boston. In fact, I'll tell you a story about my own mother. My mother was as a little girl, her parents lived in Winnipeg, went to a school in Lebret. And Lebret was a Protestant town, but a lot of the private schools in Canada are Catholic and Protestants go to them. They're very good schools. So the Ursulines had this place, and the students were resident there. One night, they got a warning from one of the people in the town, and they went out and hid on a hill right beside and watched as the Ku Klux Klan came north from the United States into Lebret, burned the school and the church to the ground. But there were movements like this, and like I'm talking probably maybe a little over 100 years ago. My mother was a very little girl at the time. So another serious problem was that the public school system taught Protestant prayers and readings from the Protestant Bible. Now that may sound kind of silly as being a different today, because in the Bibles, like if you were to speak of a Protestant Bible, you'd be talking 35 different editions of the Bible that are all slightly different translations. If you talk Catholic editions of the Bible, you're talking 5 very different translations, not very different, but 5 different translations. But at this time in history, all Protestants use the King James, all Catholics use the Douay Rheims. Okay, so they're very, very different. And children in the Catholic community didn't recognize the Bible quotes as being Bible quotes because they weren't in their language. They were all the these and thous and that sort of stuff. And so history teachings particularly often included many anti-Catholic statements. When Bishop Hughes of New York protested, armed guards were required to protect Catholic churches from rioters. He protested the idea that these prayers and things were being forced on Catholics. Eventually, the Protestant religion was moved from the public schools. I want you to know, oftentimes we talk about this idea of removing prayer from schools. It's the Catholic Church that initiated that, and it's because they would not accept the fact that their prayers were actually Protestant, and that Catholics didn't know them. Oftentimes they would say they'd say the Lord's Prayer, and when they finished the Lord's Prayer and a Catholic student didn't say, "For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory," they got beat up on the schoolyard afterwards. So there were terrible instances of this, and they tried different things. I know one school system that just had a period of silence at a set time. I was a part of a school system in Marin County where there were 5 different places the children could go for the morning prayer. A couple of them were Protestant, one was Jewish, one was Catholic. I don't know about the other, but I do know that one of them was just silence. And you could go to any one of them, but they had the break for prayer. But there were always efforts to try and work this out. American dioceses started to publish newspapers and magazines to fight rumors. But the end of the most violent anti-Catholic feelings only came with the Civil War. And they came because new Americans served bravely in the army beside the Protestant soldiers. One of the things that I think, and I speak just personally, one of the things that I think is most important to the melting pot concept of the United States is the military. The military, it's in the military where you first see the race problem resolved. It's in the military where you first see the religious problem involved, because they dealt with each one as a soldier. And so you could have roommates and people you were marching beside, people you would die for, who were for religion you'd been taught to hate. And so the military had a great role as far as melding America. And I personally think that that's lost when you have a volunteer army. You really need to, have drafting. So certain people go there, and the people who are drafted are really seen, in my mind, to be the seeds of the true America. And that's why we became much more America at the time of the Civil War. We became much more America right after the Second World War. And you notice now it's beginning to disintegrate. We're breaking off in these things. We need something that will remeld the thing. In 1818, a new parish priest arrived in Ars, France. Before entering the town, John Mary Vianney stopped on a small hill overlooking the parish and prayed for the people, whom he had heard were away from the faith. He promised to do everything in his power to bring these people back to the faith. Okay? So we're looking at post-revolutionary France at the time. At that time, in France, while religion was very important to the people, attendance at church services was very low. As you can imagine at this point in history, a lot of the clergy had been killed during the Revolution. A lot of them had left the country. A lot of the churches had been destroyed. So while the people were very strong and identified themselves as Catholic, they were not involved in church services hardly at all. With the separation of the church and state in France, there was no government or social pressure to attend church. I think of the government in France maintained the church. And so if there was no priest in an area, they'd find a priest and set them out. Well, that was gone. The second thing was this social pressure. If I were to use as an example, I'd take when I was a youngster. When I was a youngster in Pacific Beach, which is an area considered a suburb of San Diego, in Pacific Beach, right on the ocean, there was unbelievable social pressure to go to church. The social pressure did not mean you went to a Catholic church, but everyone was expected to be in church. And because of that expectation, no business was allowed to open before noon because people were at church. And church was just a part of a person's life like eating was. It was just integrated on Sunday. And that fell apart in France. And because of the revolution, many parishes were without priests. And people actually liked it that way. They could go to the church where they had them, and they could pray where they wanted and this sort of thing, but they weren't harangued by sermons and all this sort of thing. Father Vianney lived an extremely simple life, praying and fasting for his people. He personally, physically repaired the church and slowly transformed the religious life of the village. He had such great gifts of insight and understanding, he became famous all over France as a confessor. He also built a school for girls. Tell you two things about him as a confessor. Sometimes he'd spend 10 hours in the confessional. He became so famous as a confessor that people came from all over France to go to confession to him. And in many ways, he restructured the church after the French Revolution. He was not a bright man at all. He had very difficult time getting through his studies, and that's why he was sent to a nowhere parish in the middle of nowhere. But when he arrived, the gifts, the pastoral gifts he had were overpowering, and they brought people in. Just to tell you two stories about confession. The first is that when you went to Jean Marie Vianney to confession, when you finished your confession, he told you everything you left out. Now, why people enjoyed that is beyond me, but people would come from all over to go to confession to him for that. And the second thing is, he had a dialogic relationship with God. He would speak with God, and God would speak to him in his heart. And he went on, much like Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross. Many saints have this dialogic relationship with God. And a woman came into him one day. Her husband had been a very miserable man in town. And ours is built on kind of a hill. There's a bridge over a ravine right beside and that's the way you got in and left the village. That kept the village safe in times of difficulty. And he committed suicide by jumping off the ravine onto the rocks below. And so the woman asked Jean Marie Vianney, was my husband saved? And would you ask God? Jean Marie Vianney agreed. Next time the woman came into confession, Jean Marie Vianney said God had spoken to her. And he did not say whether the man was saved or lost. But what he said was, it's a long way from the bridge to the rocks. And the idea that he had the time, if he wanted to reconcile with God, he had the time to forgive. I think I could become very repentant between the bridge and the rocks, but we'll leave that for someone else, okay? Superiors and other priests had absolutely no respect for the cure of Ars because he was not very well educated, although today he is highly honored and he is the patron of parish priests. He's remembered for his self-giving transformation of the whole parish that he was in. He's, to me, an example of the real power of prayer. Like if you would look at him, you would say he had none of the gifts that would make a good priest. He wasn't a great organizer. He couldn't preach. He was not particularly astute at making brilliant ceremonies and everything. But what he was in love with the salvation of his people. And in the Catholic Church, I have watched popes who I thought were not very bright, but were very holy. And they do very well. They actually do very, very well. We've had we right now are living in the middle of the best and longest reign of popes we've ever had in our history. And by best, I mean they're holy. You may agree, some of them to me are too conservative, but the fact of the matter is every one of them is basically a saint. I think you know they canonized a lot of them, but I think every one of them is a saint right from when the Papal States were created. We'll see that later on here. In 1839, Pope Gregory XVI condemned slavery. Catholics were forbidden to maintain slaves. The slave trade enlisted in Africa long before the arrival of the Europeans. You know, when we talk about slavery, we have to understand that slavery did not start in Europe. Like if you look at the Native Americans, the Native American tribes would often enslave captives they took from other tribes. But slavery had certain rules. Like an example, the mother of Gatili Tequitha, Gatiri Tequitha, her mother was a slave, and the man who owned her was a prince in the Mohawk tribe, and he wanted to marry her. Under Native American law, you cannot marry a slave because they aren't free to say, I do. So what you have to do is you have to give her her freedom. And if she says no, she's free to leave. If she says yes, she can marry you. And they did get married, but there were certain laws governing it. Well, slavery existed in Africa among those tribes too for a very long time. So slavery was kind of many places in the world before the arrival of the Europeans. However, the Europeans, as always, greatly expanded it, and it became an international trade. That under the Europeans, Africans were like harvested out of Africa. That if you had a big tribe and you conquered another tribe, you not only enslaved them, you sold them to the Europeans. And those all came to the Americas as workers. That was the big thing. Gregory's apostolic constitution made the law of the church what had been taught for many years in the church by both the scholars and the popes, okay? The scholars and the popes for many years had taught that slavery was wrong. One of the things is that slavery is not really condemned in the scriptures. And the reason it isn't condemned in the scriptures, Paul will speak about, but the reason it's not condemned in the scriptures is because the scriptures had no authority to make slaves or not. I mean, it didn't matter. The fact of the matter is there was slavery in the Roman Empire, and Catholics had to live under slavery. And so Paul writes, if you're a Christian, how you treat your slaves, and if you're a slave, how you act towards your master. Paul says all this because slavery was a given, and they had to deal with it. And that's why it took a while for the church actually to come out with a condemnation. It would have been easier if there had been texts condemning it, but the entire Bible was composed while slavery existed. There was never a post-slavery thing in the Bible. But they'd always taught that slavery was a bad thing. This time now it became law. Many of the nations of the world had started to outlaw slavery. Denmark outlawed it in 1792, France in 1794, Vienna in 1815, Britain in 1833, and in 1841 Russia. France, England, Austria, and Prussia agreed to suppress the slave trade. Okay? The United States forbid the importation of slaves in 1808. That was the last time they could be imported. But the use of slaves would ultimately be ended only by the Civil War. The slavery issue was only one part of the great missionary movement that was set in motion by Gregory the 16th. Now, Gregory the 16th really pushes the whole business of what it is with regards to the growth of the church, with regards to missionary work. He made the cornerstone of the missionary movement the establishment of parishes and the training of local clergy. Now, you remember that was one of the big problems with regards to South America. Spain wanted to provide the clergy for South America. And again, the key, and Benedict's the one who notices this, the key is the native clergy, okay? And I think one of the really difficult things, it was very hard for the Romans to come to understand they didn't own the church. And then it was very hard for Europeans to come to understand they didn't own the church. And you know, it's only with John the 23rd that we began to see an expansion of, like, the College of Cardinals into other nations, lots of cardinals from other nations, and that's been going on by popes. But what we're watching is the church ceasing to be European, okay? And I remember when I was a youngster, when they used to say something isn't obvious, well, they say, isn't the Pope Catholic? Well, the fact of the matter is, no. That's changed, but all that's very recent, okay? So he organized mission lands more carefully by dividing the territories among religious orders and establishing lines of communication with Rome, okay? So missionaries in Spain were not so much in contact with the Spanish government, they were in contact with the Pope. And oftentimes you would find in missionary countries, let's say like South America, when the Jesuits were suppressed, you'd find the Dominicans and the Franciscans competing to be who had the most people, who had the best parishes, who had the influence in the government. Previously, they'd both been competing with the Jesuits, but the Jesuits, there's no competition for that. They were the ones into the government and everything, and largely through their educational thing. So what we see now is this rise of the community by setting up and separating the religious orders and bringing lines of communication with Rome. A Jewish convert by the name of Franz Maria Liebermann entered a seminary to become a priest, and there learned from African students the plight of the Africans. So he learned from them when he was in the seminary what was going on. He founded the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart of Mary to work among the blacks. Many people joined the order, which united with another order to form the Holy Ghost Fathers. Lieberman's advice was to become black and not make the people into Europeans. He says, go before them as servants before your masters. Okay? So he had them come in. Now, you see that Africa had been dealing with this whole idea of Europeans being masters who took them as slaves and this sort of thing. And he said, you go in as though they're your masters. You go in that way. Conversions in Africa were very strong. The church is very strong in Africa today. And it began at this part of time. Probably the most interesting one in the world is Korea. We'll go through that. Korea was a particularly difficult problem for the church. During the Japanese occupation of Korea, 1592 to 1599, some soldiers had baptized some children, and later some Korean slaves in Japan had converted and suffered martyrdom. Now remember, Korea was occupied by Japan, but there were some Catholics in Japan. In fact, there's a famous movie, I think it's called The Manchurian Candidate. And in the movie, one of the great scenes is an American soldier shoots a Japanese soldier. And when he goes down and sees the body, a rosary has fallen out of the pocket. There were Catholics in Japan at the time. And some of them baptized these children, a newly born child or something, or they're afraid they would die, or little children. They baptized them. And then there were some Korean slaves. Koreans were enslaved in Japan. Some of them had been converted and suffered martyrdom. There was no Korean church. Foreigners were not allowed into the country, making it easy for the government to find and eliminate missionaries. Missionaries had to come from another country, and you could pick out non-Koreans in the country very easily. And so it was very, very different. A man by the name of Pekiai, a Korean scholar, discovered a book about Christianity and the gospel. And when a friend was going to China to see the emperor, he asked his friend to make some contact with the missionaries. So we had the missionaries in China. So he's just read about the faith, doesn't know anything about it, and so he asked the guy who's going to China to make some contact. Ri Sung, that's the friend, found the missionaries and was baptized. He returned to Korea and he baptized Pekinese. Okay, so now we have two Koreans officially baptized, one baptized by a priest and the other baptized by the man. Still, no clergy. The two of them began to preach the Catholic faith, and by the time a priest did come from China, the name of the priest was James Su, he found 4,000 Catholics. Now imagine, no missionaries, no priests, no nuns, no church. 4,000 Catholics. There was a terrible persecution. About 300 were killed, leaving the church with 10,000 people. So the church just continued to grow there. But the great power of the Korean church was the Koreans, not missionaries or anything. It is the Koreans themselves. In 1884, another priest came from China to be followed by an apostolic vicar and two French missionaries. Okay, an apostolic vicar is a representative of the Pope in the area. That's in an area that it's difficult to communicate with, because remember, the missionaries were put in direct contact with the Pope. Well, here it's difficult to communicate with the Pope, largely because it would be seen as a foreign power by the Koreans, who were very wary of foreigners at the time. And so an apostolic vicar arrives, basically the presence of the Pope there. There was another terrible persecution, and again, the church got bigger. In 1880, the Catholic Church was legalized, and by the time of the First World War, there was between 65,000 and 75,000 Koreans who were Catholic. Okay, in 1880s, in China, there had been Catholic missionaries since the 1200s. We mentioned that. But there was a dispute among the different missionaries as to whether or not to adapt Chinese customs. The Jesuits particularly wanted the church and the liturgy to take on the cultural practices of the Chinese, and beginning with the priest by the name of Ricci. We discussed him earlier. This was very, very successful. The church was growing powerfully in China. Many of the orders at this time in history were very jealous of one another. Some of the other orders, and most particularly the Dominicans, remember one of the popes was Dominican, objected, saying that this diminished the faith. Now, I don't think they were so much objecting to the Chinese customs being brought into the faith as they were objecting to the Jesuits. They wanted to be into the missionary thing there. The church ruled against the Jesuits, with the result that the Chinese began to see the missionaries as agents of foreign and hostile governments. As a result of that, the Chinese government would no longer support, nor would it protect the missionaries. Up to this point, the Chinese government was very powerful in protecting missionaries and in giving them financial support, giving them land to build, they give them the buildings. The government had been very, very supportive of the church with these Chinese missionaries doing this sort of thing. And this all ended at this point. By the 1800s, there were 250,000 Catholics in China, several dozen missionaries, and 50 Chinese priests. A French priest, Jean Perboret, traveled through China in 1835, and in his letters, he described the great difficulties that Chinese Catholics were going through and the type of persecutions they were suffering. He was arrested, tried, and executed, along with some other Catholics. Around the middle of the 19th century, France and Great Britain established treaty ports for trade with China. And in these ports, Christians were free to practice their faith. Hong Kong, Macau, these were ports. The port was given to a foreign country, so it was like a little piece of England at Hong Kong. But what they could do was that little piece of England at Hong Kong could trade with all of China and export to England and import from England and trade that into China. So these trade ports were treaty ports, were founded in the land by treaty given. The land was only given for a certain period of time. In fact, I think many of us remember a few years ago when Hong Kong was officially returned to China. It's because it actually was to be in the hands of England only a certain length of time. These ports provided great opportunities for missionary work in China because you could bring the Chinese into the port, Chinese who wouldn't be allowed to leave China. They could educate them in Christianity and send them back where the Christian teachers couldn't go into China. But it was a great thing for the church. Protestant missionaries entered China in 1807, and by 1850, there were only 100 Protestants in China. But the great push of Protestant missionaries would come later. In 1836, Marist missionaries from France went to Micronesia. Micronesia is the islands, South Pacific, Samoa, Tahiti, Tonga, those areas, okay? They were sent personally by Gregory the 16th. In fact, the Marist Society, the Society of Mary, the Marists, were established specifically to be missionaries to Micronesia. Father Chanel and a companion landed on the island of Fortuna. They set about adapting to the climate and culture. And I remember, this may sound crazy, but I remember when I was first assigned to Hawaii, it takes, if you're going to actually live there, it takes quite an adaptation to the culture and to the climate. The climate is extremely damp. The island I was on, Kauai, has the highest rainfall in the world. It rains almost every day. And your clothes and everything would always be damp. If you layered clothing, not only would you get unbelievably hot, but simultaneously you'd encourage mildew. If you left hosts in a tabernacle for 3 weeks, they would all be mildewed. Hosts were kept canned, like soup. And you would open the thing and consecrate the hosts, use them at the service, and consume what was left. You didn't leave hosts. They would turn to mold. All kinds of things like that as far as clothing and housing and everything. If you go over there, it's very different as a tourist because like you stay in an air-conditioned hotel and you go to air-conditioned buildings and stuff like that. But you don't as a missionary there. That's not the way the people live. Okay, so they go on. So they set about adapting. Another thing about the culture, the Hawaiians are very, very into contact. It's curious to me What might be going on in Hawaii now with regards to the pandemic? I have no idea, because you had to be out in front of the church for at least an hour before Mass, because everyone congregated out there. Then you had to stay there an hour after Mass, because everyone congregated there, and everyone would meet. And this sometimes it's the only time they had to meet people. Most of them didn't have cars. A lot of them had bicycles. But they would go out to their plantations where they were working and stuff. But the one time they came together was Sunday, so it was a big deal. You had to time Masses, so you had all this time to be with people before and after and this sort of thing. Also, another thing, the rectory, the way the harvesting of cane, when I was there, Kauai entirely produced cane. Today it's coffee. The cane is gone. But they entirely produced sugar cane. And sugar cane work in the fields began at 4 a.m. And it would go on until about 4 p.m. and doing different things in different shifts, but it would work that way. In the rectory, you had to know that you needed to be up by 2, because people who wanted to see you before they went to work would knock on your door 2, 3 in the morning. And then at 4, you had to be at the rectory for people who wanted to see you after work at that time for a couple of hours. And then no one made appointments. You would come in, and that's the system. The benefit, you were free from 4 to 4. Nothing would happen at the rectory. So they set about doing this. And while Peter Chanel studied the language, he prepared a dictionary. He cared for the sick and preached. After a few of the natives converted, the chief became fearful that the priest was undermining his authority, and he sent his chief minister to kill Peter Chanel. He was clubbed to death, April 28, 1841. When the French ship returned to recover the body of Father Chanel, 6 months later, he found that the natives there were not hostile in any sense of the term. The natives requested another missionary, and in 1 year and a half, all the natives were baptized, even the man who'd murdered Chanel. Okay? So that it wasn't hostility to the church or anything, it was just a whim of the chief. So they did it, and then it was all over. And one of the interesting things is the area of the mission area of the Maris in the South Pacific is very strongly Catholic. And all through there, they have a native clergy and all this sort of thing. It's very, very good. Through the Enlightenment, people tended to look on religious orders as useless, and monasteries and convents as cozy havens for the younger children of the nobility. Okay? The way the family was organized is the oldest son was heir to the fortune. The next oldest son usually went into the hierarchy of the church. And we're talking, wealthy people. After that, many of them went into monasteries and stuff like that and lived there. And the monasteries oftentimes were very, very comfortable lives. They had serfs and things that did the work and this sort of thing. And so they didn't view the monasteries like we do. Like the monasteries in the United States support themselves either by educating people or something like this. They certainly get donations and like that. But that is not what keeps monasteries going. Okay? Only the parish priests kept the affection of the people. So the people remained very loyal to the parish priests. They hated the hierarchy. They were considered royalty, and they did not like the religious orders. Now, this is all in France, okay? In the 19th century, religious orders would again flourish. At least 88 communities of men were founded. Women religious set about founding many orders for teaching hospital work, for work on the battlefields. There were nuns who functioned as nurses on the battlefields. Almost all nurses at this time were religious of one kind or another, and caring for people with incurable disease. The Jesuits at this point were reestablished in France. The Dominicans were reestablished in France by a priest by the name of Father Lacordaire. And Dom Guéranger reestablished the Benedictine Abbey of Salem. Salem is probably the most famous abbey in the world for the recitation of the office, and they're the ones that have prepared the music historically that is used in the office. I think they began to, when I was in the seminary in 1959, the books we used came from Salem, and we did the office in Latin. But now that the office is done in English, a famous French musician at the time I was in the seminary, forget his name right now, Gélanol. Gélanol did music for all the Psalms so that they had them in French. And his music was so good that each time he published one, it went right to the top of the hit parade in France. His music is magnificent. And I don't know who's responsible for the music for the English that we use. But anyway, each country developed their own after that. But Salem, from the 1800s up until about 1965, that was what was used everywhere. There was great life and spirit in the monastic movements taking place in France. But now remember, at this time, because of what happened during the French Revolution, the monasteries were no longer being supported by the government. So they were supporting themselves. It's a very different thing if you're seen as, being supported by the government, which basically is my taxes, or you're supporting yourself. By the end of the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. And what we call hand tools were gradually being replaced by power-driven machines. Beginning in England, the Industrial Revolution soon spread to North America, Belgium, and France. It was not that the machines were new. A lot of machines we'd had for a very long time. But in the past, they served in homes to spin, like for instance, if you think of a spinning wheel is a machine. And so it would be in the home, and you would use it to spin thread. Then all the thread would be taken to a home where it would be woven into fabrics. Corn was ground and then sold with the help of traders. And this is what we know today as cottage industries. And oftentimes when missionaries go into an area where people are completely impoverished and don't know how to get out of poverty, the model in the people's mind is the West. So like, for instance, you would have a small tribe in Africa, for instance, that's in dire poverty. But when they think about how to get out of poverty, they think about opening a Toyota plant, which they can't do, or opening a high-tech business. They can't do that. But they can do this. So missionaries come in and start cottage industries. So it's possible for you to buy a shirt, for instance, that's actually hand-woven. And the material has been hand-woven there. They do it in a cottage industry, and that will eventually graduate into a big industry. But it begins this cottage industry. And when Gandhi was trying to free India from England, that was what he did. He started cottage industries all over India. And I think I've mentioned to you before, if you look at the Indian flag, in the center of the Indian flag is a circle, and it's actually the wheel off a spinning wheel, because it was the spinning of material and cloth that gave them their society and everything. The 18th century saw a huge interest in improving the quality and increasing the speed of production, okay? So they wanted better quality, which in our time, we have standardized quality. You want better quality, and you want to increase the speed of production. In the age of the cottage industry, work was part-time, and the major work had always remained farming, so that you would farm, and then in the evenings you could spin cloth and that sort of thing. But the discovery of steam and the discoveries of science pointed to the fact there was much that could be done to improve production. And what we have watched, beginning with the Industrial Revolution, we have watched the mechanization of everything so that it's mechanized. Basically, if you were to look at the spinning of thread today, it's still basically the spinning wheel. It's just in a massive machine that's run electrically and all kinds of things. And we'll watch that goes on. And, you know, you think about it, when I was a little boy, one of the things, my father was involved in the Atlas missile, and he worked with the very first computer that was UNIVAC. And UNIVAC was housed in several buildings and had punch cards in it that the machine would go through. But it was the first time thinking was mechanized. And computers have mechanized thinking itself. And when my dad in the last years of his life always carried a pen in his pocket. They used to give them away free at the bank. And the pen had a adding machine calculator in it, this sort of thing. The reason my dad carried it is because that pen had more calculating power than the UNIVAC he started with. And the UNIVAC, God knows how much they paid for it. They give you the pen for free. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which separated the seeds from cotton and greatly improved the speed of cotton production, at the same time dropped the price dramatically. From this point on, cottage industry was on its way out. See, they could weave the stuff, but if you ever see a cotton ball, it's a ball of cotton, and the seeds are inside it, and they are joined to the fibers. And so what you have to do is individually pull the seeds out. And Eli Whitney invented what we call the cotton gin, but he invented the cotton gin, and it separated the seeds. And once that was done, the mechanization of cotton was the only thing they had to mechanize after that is how to harvest the cotton. And I'm sure they do it by mechanization today, but I'm not sure how. In the past, goods were produced for the wealthy, but now cheaper goods were available for everyone. Factory workers were drawn away from farms, and cities began to grow very quickly. But there were many problems. Factories were noisy, hot, and dirty, as well as dangerous. As you can imagine, there was no protection for workers at this time. Industrial accidents killed people and stuff like that. Men, women, and children worked from sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. Bosses tend to be dictators, and workers had absolutely no rights. The workers' homes were dirty and small, with many people crowded into few rooms. And as a result of that, we know, like with the pandemic now, as a result of that, when you have a lot of people crowded closer together, it's very dangerous for the spread of disease. Anyone gets something, everyone's got it. Several families often shared a single room. There were no playgrounds or amusements or anything for children. And so there were a number of novels written around this time by famous British authors that show the negative impact of the Industrial Revolution at its beginning on society and family life. Let's stop this right here, and we will pick it up here next week. Thank you very much.